Okay, welcome. I am here today, everyone, with Jeremy R. Hammond. I'm telling him your whole name because he wants to differentiate that there's a hacker who he is not that person, but also because his website is jeremyrhammond.com, and he has several collections of articles that are just really important pieces in our field. So, we're going to be talking today about natural immunity. He has a seven-part series on the superiority of natural immunity to the vaccine program. He has an independent journalist that is very just widely renowned and regarded in our field for multiple reasons. I'm just showing you his website so that you can see all of the excellent, detailed articles that he has here. It just keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. But he is the author of several books. So when people on our team really get ganged up on, he has several books, including The War on Informed Consent. And this is all about the persecution of Dr. Paul Thomas by the Oregon Medical Board. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation today because I think that he's going to hit a little bit about censorship and answer some more mindset questions. But he also has this incredible resource, which you can get if you go to his website and sign up for his newsletter, which I highly encourage you to stay in touch with him. You'll actually get this download that's about the different persecutions of the New York Times versus our heavyweight champion, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., whom we all love. So thank you so much for being with us today. You can go and connect with jeremyrhammond.com. And thank you, for talking with us today about the superiority of natural immunity.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I think it's a really important topic, and it speaks to the total lack of trustworthiness of the so-called public health establishment.
Well, so take us, you can either start with history, you can start with censorship, take us back to 2020, because they were already really lying prolifically in the summer, you said. So take us back to the early days.
Yeah, if you look in the throughout the summer and fall of 2020, during the lockdown regimes, we were bombarded with all these headlines about natural immunity, people who had gotten COVID and then they recovered, and then there were these headlines about how they were losing their immunity, and we needed a vaccine to save us. And this was the propaganda campaign throughout the summer and fall, right up to the point where the vaccines received emergency use authorization in December 2020 from the FDA. And so if you look at what those headlines were based on, they were looking at studies where researchers had looked at antibody levels in the blood of individuals who'd recovered from COVID-19. And they noticed that there was a rapid decline in antibody levels. And so there were scientists who were complicit in this propaganda campaign, either because they were speaking to the media and telling the media that this meant that people were losing their immunity, which they knew to be untrue, or they were just silent and not correcting the media when the media completely misrepresented what this finding meant. So it was interpreted, as I mentioned, as meaning that because the people were losing, the antibody levels were coming down, therefore their immunity was being lost. That was complete nonsense, and every immunologist who published these studies knew that it was nonsense, and that wasn't the right interpretation, because it's completely normal and it's totally expected that that's what happens after the acute phase of infection. So as you have an infection, it actually takes a week or two for antibodies to develop, but you also have cellular immune responses in the meantime that are active and helping to reduce disease symptoms. Eventually, antibodies come into play, and they can neutralize the virus. After during the acute phase of infection, you develop a very high level of antibodies. And it's completely normal that once you've recovered, for those antibody levels to come down. It's totally expected. That's the way it works with other viruses as well. This is nothing unusual. So for the media to point to that and say, "Oh, this means people are losing their antibodies," was completely unscientific. Talk about anti-science nonsense. That was complete anti-science nonsense. But those were the headlines all throughout the summer and fall. And by the time the vaccines had received the emergency use authorization by the FDA, Again, that was December 2020. The CDC at that time was telling people that that scientists don't know the duration of natural immunity, which was true because because of course it had persisted for as long as studies had looked, which hadn't been that long at that point in time. But then they said that the scientific evidence indicates that it's short-lived, which was completely false because the studies by that time had already shown that yes, after the normal rapid decline from peak levels during the acute phase of infection, the antibody levels plateaued and remained and persisted. And I'm talking about like neutralizing IgG antibodies. So that the type of antibodies that are capable of actually neutralizing the virus and preventing them from infecting the cells. And that antibodies were persistent in people who had recovered. And almost all people who had recovered from COVID-19 had persistent antibodies. So the CDC was flat out lying to the public by telling them that it appeared to be short-lived. That was untrue. And also there were indications at that time that the reason for the persistence of antibodies at this lower level was likely due to the induction of what are known as long-lived bone marrow plasma cells, which were a type of cell that are an immunological marker of long-term immunity. And so there was also this deception that people needed, even people who recovered, the CDC said, even people who recovered from COVID and had natural immunity needed the vaccine to increase their antibody levels. Well, this was also complete nonsense because, in fact, if you look at people's immune systems and the studies that had been done into how immunity works to SARS-CoV-2, which is the coronavirus that causes COVID-19, in fact, a high level of antibodies was associated with severe disease.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is simply that cellular immune responses, the T cell immunity, is actually more important for protection against COVID-19. And so this was already known by the time the vaccines were rolled out in the fall or in the winter of 2020. So the CDC was basically lying through its teeth, and they were telling people that they needed the vaccines to increase their levels of antibodies, but this completely ignored the role of immunological memory. So people who had already recovered, sure, their antibody levels had declined and maybe were persisting at a lower level, but that doesn't mean they didn't have protection, because of course there was immunological memory, and that was confirmed in May of 2021. It was confirmed by scientists that in fact natural immunity involves the induction of long-term immunological memory. So this again, the CDC is just blatant deceptions and willful deceptions taking
Mm-hmm.
place in order to promote the vaccines and try to manufacture consent for their policy goal of achieving high vaccination rates. And so the media were complicit in this campaign of deception. There were scientists who were complicit in the campaign of deception. Of course, all the public health. I always put the quotation marks around the term public health. The so-called public health agencies were complicit in a campaign of deception, very much like the campaign of deception that preceded the Iraq War, where they were lying about weapons of mass destruction. The same type of organized, orchestrated disinformation campaign. And of course, anyone who spoke out against the official disinformation was accused of spreading quote unquote misinformation. I was
Yeah,
banned from LinkedIn.
they were accused of what they were actually doing. That is a natural question is, well, where was the dissent, which I can't wait for you to speak
Mm.
to. But just to back up a little bit, you have very thoroughly addressed the fact that natural immunity is durable. And you've spoken to this on multiple levels. You talk on your website about how there was manufactured consent through selective information, disinformation. And you said that if the public were told the truth, that natural immunity is robust, it's broad, it's durable, and it's superior to the immunity that's conferred by the COVID-19 vaccines, you don't believe many people would take it. Before we get into the propaganda, which I know you have so many great stories on that, can you go back for us? You really hit this point on it's a durable
Mm. Yeah.
immunological response. There's, immune memory, but can you hit just quickly robust, broad, and superior?
Yes. Yes.
Because we have this issue of the marketing campaigns for the different variants. So
Right.
someone made the joke that we have a new variant, BS 24/7 is coming. um, but there've been several variants. So tell us about robust and
Mhm.
broad immunity.
Yeah, that was another. I'm glad you brought that up. That was another deception coming straight from the so-called public health authorities, where they were claiming that because they would vaccinate people who already had natural immunity, and so they were claiming that 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 everyone who, again, saying that everyone who already had infection and recovered still needed to get the vaccines. And a different angle they took to encourage people to do that was that they were saying that the vaccines would offer more protection against variants.
Yeah.
Now, again, looking at the basis for that claim, it reveals what anti-science nonsense that was, because what they were looking at, they didn't have studies where they compared like rates of COVID-19 again, between people who just had natural immunity, people who just had the vaccines, and people who had what they call hybrid immunity, who got vaccinated after infection. They didn't have studies on the effectiveness of the vaccines, and in terms of like clinical significance. But all they were doing is they're again looking at antibody levels in the blood, and so they were just noticing that, yeah, if you vaccinate someone who already had natural immunity, yeah, sure, it increases their level of antibodies, but that just goes right back to the same fallacy where they're saying antibodies equal immunity, which is untrue. It's not true. And so, of course, again, this completely overlooked the role of immunological memory. And, if anyone was actually re-exposed, anyone who has natural immunity and you're re-exposed to the virus, guess what happens to your antibodies? Your immune system doesn't have to relearn how to generate those antibodies again. It doesn't take a week or 2 weeks to like develop those antibodies again. You have the memory
Mhm.
of the response, and so you can generate antibodies very quickly and your levels go back up again. It's called exogenous boosting. This is natural boosting, and so people will get a natural booster every time they're re-exposed to the virus. And so, yeah, that's the broad. And also, you think just in terms of the immunology of it, there's the vaccines are very narrowly focused. This is, I mean, if you think about it, this is kind of common sense that the vaccines are designed to produce, they send mRNA into your body that carries the instructions for the cells to produce the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2, just the spike protein. Whereas when you have infection, guess what? You have an immune response to the whole virus. There's the nucleocapsid protein, there's the membrane protein, there's other parts of the virus that the immune system recognizes within an infection, and you build up this broad, robust immune response. And yes, obviously the neutralizing antibodies that bind with the spike protein are very important for prevention of infection. But that's, again, this overlooks the whole role of cellular immunity. And it's interesting how when in November of 2021, when they started recommending boosters again, after witnessing that vaccinated people, after admitting, the CDC admitted in August 2021 that vaccinated people could spread the virus, even though they were sold to the public on the basis of the lie that 2 doses would confer durable sterilizing immunity, meaning it would prevent infection and transmission. That was a lie. So they admitted that finally in August 2021. But then suddenly they discovered cellular immunity, and they were like, but don't worry, because the vaccines also induce T cell responses. And so that will continue to protect you against severe disease, even if you become infected. So, like, why weren't they educating the public about cellular immunity during the summer of 2020 when they were acting as though that didn't exist? And they were saying that a declining level of antibodies meant you were losing your immunity. So
Wow.
suddenly the message
Wow.
just got completely flipped.
Yeah,
And
when
they
it
started
suited them.
educating the public about T cell responses.
That's
Well, that's an
amazing.
interesting, right?
That's incredible.
Yes. So the hypocrisy is just staggering, right? And so that's just an indication of how they're not interested in educating the public. They're not interested in explaining, basic immunology to people. And I'm not an immunologist. I don't have an in-depth understanding of immunology, but all it takes is like a basic fundamental understanding of the immune system to see how they were like deliberately lying to the public, willfully, deliberately lying
And this is
in
something that
pursuit of a
many
policy goal.
Yeah, to further a policy goal. And this is something that many doctors immediately, as they were educated in this, spoke out about. So I'd love you to tell us a little bit about your research into the persecution of some of these doctors, because you have done excellent research on that. But what encouragement do you have for a lot of people? You said you're not an immunologist. You're certainly speaking very, passionately and in an informed way about all of these things. For the average person who might wonder, well, who am I to kind of know the details of this? It seems like there's consensus at the top. People are saying this. I'm certainly not smart enough to know the difference. I think that we're honestly in an age of repeated crimes, repeated deception, where we have a knowledge differential that's now escalated into a power differential, where because people don't know these basic facts, they're not catching the ways that they're being lied to. And
Right.
as we just have more advancement in sciences and different things, I do think that there is kind of a level of needing to know the basics that people do have, which is what people are here for the Health Freedom Summit to know about and to learn these things. So thank you for taking the time to give us a summary. All of your articles are just this in depth. Like if you're ever in an argument with someone and you need to pull out just the heavy guns. His website is so full of just these excellent articles, and it's such a delight. I feel like you really have an energy or curiosity or fascination to like get into these things and to understand them, and your energy and passion for it is just truly incredible. So I love the energy that you bring to your pursuits is amazing, because you love catching them in, no, you did say this. No, you were propagating that message. Here are your headlines.
Well,
You
because they're
put
trying
it
to
back in their
gaslight
face.
us.
You
Yeah.
seem to have a particular joy in your work.
Yeah, I do. I guess I do enjoy exposing government official disinformation, because it's so important. I mean, frankly, I wish I didn't have to do what I do. I wish the mainstream media would do their jobs, but they don't. So this is why I do what I do. And I'm glad you appreciate the depth of my writings, because one of the things I try to do is to produce, like, when I come to a conclusion, I want it to be as airtight and solid as possible. And so one of the things I'm doing is I'm anticipating the objections, because I know, if I say this, I know what, the propagandists are going to how they're going to respond to it. And so I'll just preempt that objection in the writing. And so it is a lot more in depth than your typical articles. A lot more long form type of content that I do, but it is the type of content, like if you really want to have a good solid understanding of an issue, it's perfect for that. And you could go and read 100 other articles and spend countless hours reading other things, and still not get the same amount of information, as concisely put together. And so that's really what I'm aiming to do for my readers, is to deliver value in that way. So if they really want to kind of get their, to understand these issues, like on natural immunity versus vaccine induced immunity, I'm hopefully putting together some really good resources for people to be able to do that.
Yeah, this is incredible. Someone complimented your work and they said it's almost at the level of like you could just take this into a court. It's so excellent, the precision with which it lays out the proofs. And you are hoping in the future to potentially come out with courses that teach people how to think,
Yes.
design thinking, and how to research and how to write and how to stay productive and focused enough that they're finishing pieces. So I want to encourage you to do that, because teaching more people to do what you do would be wonderful. And if you get on his newsletter, I'm sure that you will get an email with when that comes out.
Yes.
But tell us a little bit about your writing on the behalf of like Dr. Paul Thomas and Bobby Kennedy. Tell us what you've done. Because another objection that people might have is, well, how could so many people blatantly lie about such basic facts of natural immunity? How do they do that with a straight face? Why
Mm.
isn't there more accountability? Why did the quality and protection mechanisms, why have those failed? Can you speak to that a little bit in the closing minutes here of the interview?
Yeah, sure. That's a really good question because, of course, the first thing people think of, like like people who are just kind of indoctrinated in like the official dogma of things, if you start talking about, the limited benefits or the harms of vaccines, they kind of have this wall goes up, and they're like, well, how can all these doctors, how can the entire medical establishment get it wrong? And my first response to that is, well, it's not as though the medical establishment hasn't gotten it wrong before. And secondly is what people just don't understand is just the thorough corruption of the scientific community in the journals. So that the journals themselves are part of the problem. And this speaks to my book, The War on Informed Consent, about the persecution of Dr. Paul Thomas, and how, in fact, after I had written that book, the journal article I described in that book, which was a study that Dr. Paul Thomas did using his patients' data with Dr. James Lyons Weiler as data analyst, looking at the health outcomes of his patients and comparing his completely unvaccinated patients with his variably vaccinated patients, and showing just an incredible disparity in the health outcomes, where the unvaccinated patients were clearly the healthiest children in his practice. And within days of that study being published, the Oregon Medical Board emergently suspended his license, even though they had asked him. In fact, they had demanded that he produce peer-reviewed evidence to support his alternative approach in his clinic in Portland, Oregon, which, of course, his alternative approach being to respect the right of parents to make their own informed choices, where he views his role as just providing information, instead of the role that the state wanted for him was to push the CDC schedule on people, push the schedule, tell them they have to get all the vaccines. That's your only job as a doctor. So the state views physicians and pediatricians as fulfilling an administrative function in service to the state. Dr. Thomas doesn't agree. He views his role as being to provide informed consent, and that's the fundamental dispute between the state and Dr. Thomas that led to the suspension of his license.
But even
And
before his license was taken, and I mean, just imagine how much money it costs to go to school and all of that time and money and effort, and then to have your license threatened. But even before that point, which I think most people could be very sympathetic with, he said that his practice lost $1 million in revenue the year that they stopped just complying across the board with the CDC schedule. And I've heard it said that, well, it's really easy to forget something that you've seen if you get $1 million, if you can forget it, and so
yeah,
the
it speaks to the financial incentives. This is another, to answer the question, it's a big question. Like, why, how can this be? Why, where are all the people speaking out against these things if it's so brazen, right? And it's, again, going to the corruption, it speaks to that. So there's these financial incentives, and there's doctors are not immune to confirmation biases. And Dr. Thomas speaks to this, and I write about this in the book, where, he started out practicing medicine the way he was taught to, which meant vaccinating according to the CDC's recommendations and encouraging people to do that. And it was only because he's kind of a unique individual who is able to kind of overcome his own confirmation biases, and where you can imagine a physician, who's vaccinating children, believing that this is the right thing to do and that this is good for them and this is the right approach. And number one, it takes a certain kind of individual to ask themselves the question: is what I'm doing, is instead of helping them, is it causing them harm? It takes a certain kind of unique personality to first ask that question and then to actually pursue the answer to that question. And so that's, we
at
have this
your own
rare
personal
individual.
detriment.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's Dr. Thomas is that type of individual. He's a gift, right? So he did that. And so he went through his own journey of awakening, where he explained, in medical school, you're just not taught anything about vaccines other than they're great, they're wonderful, they're the best invention. in on all of medical history, and everyone should get every one of them. I
Well,
mean,
the
that's what.
pharmaceutical companies do write and produce a lot of the textbooks that are
Mhm,
used in medical school. So it's not just the
right.
articles, it's also the textbooks.
Right. And if you look at, another big thing that people need to understand in terms of, the corruption within the scientific community is where the funding comes from, because you look at
Right.
studies and it's either funded by the pharmaceutical companies themselves. And of course, if they do studies that they don't like the outcomes of, they can just kind of brush them away. And they just deliver to the FDA the studies that show the outcomes that they want, and the FDA gives its rubber stamp of approval. And also the other source of funding, the other major source of funding is the government itself. And so you
Yeah,
have
the
guys like
NIH.
Anthony Fauci deciding like what types of studies get funded or not. And so this completely corrupts the entire uh, direction of science and the direction of research.
And it's compounded by a lack of donations through the universities are broke. The donations are not coming in through other things. And so if you are, a scientist or a doctor at the height of your career, there's only money coming from a few people. And if they have well publicized interest for you to publish against that is
Yeah.
the end of your career trajectory. The power is definitely consolidating in
Yeah.
these fields in a way that is very traceable where the money is and where it's coming from, and then two, just the availability of jobs. But yeah, for a lot of
Mhm.
people, the I mean, which I think your work is so powerful because you are both publicizing about the corruption and the collusion within other fields, but you're also actually living the opposite. You're like a living testament of, I'm not in the mainstream media. I'm here taking donations and taking hours and hours of my time to be an independent journalist. I'm not bought and paid for. I'm pursuing the truth. So you're kind of like this living testament of what the solution is, which I really love. That's incredible.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah. And
Because we
coming
need that
back,
in
I
all
was going to
fields.
make a
We need
point
that in
about the,
medicine. We need that in
yeah.
science. What you're living, we need everyone to start doing that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I am kind of the anti-media,
Yeah,
at least the anti-establishment
you're the
legacy media.
antidote.
Yeah. But I was going to make a point. I was coming back to, I was going to say that the study that Dr. Thomas and Dr. Lyons Weiler did was, after I wrote the book, that study was retracted. And so that was the point I was going to get to. This is an example of the corruption within where the journals are part of the problem. Where number one, if you write a study that is like critical of public vaccine policy or shows harms of vaccines or something, like those types of studies are less likely to get published in the first place. And when they do, they're not treated to the same standard. If you can put out any kind of like rubbish, just pure pseudoscientific nonsense, and as long as if it's supportive of CDC policy, that's fine. It gets published. A recent example is a study that was supposedly done, a study of misinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic, where they called out these physicians who on social media were spreading what they called misinformation. The authors of the study accused them of that, but they defined misinformation as anything that went against what the CDC said. I'm sorry, but how unscientific can you get? Of course, as though the CDC was infallible. I mean, if there is no greater purveyor of vaccine misinformation than the CDC. And so that's the level of, the anti-intellectualism within the scientific, but that kind of trash can get published fine. But when you publish a study like Dr. Thomas's and Dr. Lyons Weiler's, it was a really solid study. And I cover it in great detail, in depth of what the significance, how they did the study, and the significance in my book. But the retraction of that study was based on an anonymously written letter that complained that they had used a non-valid measurement, which was what they called in the study. They talked about the relative incidence of office visits, RIOV, which they did alongside the usual old standard method of just incidence of diagnoses, like does the child have this diagnosis or not? Yes, no, this binary yes, no, which doesn't give you a whole lot of information. It just tells you whether they've had the diagnosis or not. So they came up with this they had this kind of advancing the methodology to come up with ROIOV, which gives a lot more information because they're looking at incidence of office visits for that diagnosis, which tells you a lot more because it indicates the severity of the disease. So it's not just do they have a diagnosis or not, it's how severe is it.
Right, like, how often is this child coming in for emergency asthma treatment, or
Precisely.
emergency, like, or just this child came in 17 times for eczema, and it's really a bad case, not just do they have it or not.
Exactly. Exactly. And so to retract the study on the basis that they developed a new method, I mean, it's how unscientific can you possibly get? Like, the logic behind that is like, okay, so if you could never publish anything that was new in terms of methodology, science could never progress. It's an absurdity. And the other accusation that was leveled against the study was it was a hypothesized selection bias. For a study to be retracted based on the possibility of a selection bias is utterly absurd. You couldn't publish any observational study if that was the standard. I mean, so the basis for the retraction of the study is it's completely unscientific. And so the selection bias they're referring to is the anonymously written letter complained that hypothesized that the study's findings didn't mean that the unvaccinated kids were really that much healthier. It's just that their parents didn't care about their kids enough to take them in to see the doctor, and so they didn't know that their kids were so sick, which is absurd. And it's absurd on its face. And I know as a parent of a completely unvaccinated child, the reason I don't vaccinate him is precisely because I am so sensitive to his health, and care about his health so much and care about him so much. But the insult aside, in the study itself, they actually had already addressed that because they did a control in the study where they looked at rates of fever, which is an expected outcome of vaccination, and incidence of well child visits. And it wasn't the case that the children who were unvaccinated weren't coming in for routine visits. It just wasn't true.
Hmm.
And then more recently, Dr. James Lyons Weiler has worked with Dr. Russell Blaylock because Dr. Thomas was prohibited from doing any further research. Dr. Jack worked with Dr. Blaylock and produced a follow-up analysis where they did numerous additional analyses and just clearly showed that this whole theoretical selection bias, which would be like a differences in healthcare usage was the hypothesis, is just not true. That in fact, if anything, the children who are completely unvaccinated went in for routine checkups even more so than the parents who vaccinated, which makes a lot of sense in the case of Dr. Thomas's clinic because, the parents who don't vaccinate their children, there would be no reason for them to fear going in and being bullied, whereas in a typical pediatrician's office, like you're hesitant to go in to even take your child in to see the doc. I know from personal experience, you don't want to go in and have that visit because it's just going to be uncomfortable and they're going to try to push the vaccines on you. And it's just going to become an uncomfortable situation where you're going to have to try to defend your decision against their bullying. And in fact, after I wrote that book, my wife and I, we were expelled from the pediatric clinic that we were taking our son to, for our decisions to not vaccinate him. And so we've undergone that bullying ourselves. So it makes a lot of sense in the case of his particular practice that the unvaccinated children showed up for the well child visits routinely, and it just wasn't the case that this selection bias even existed. But those were the bases for the retraction, completely unscientific, completely unjustified. But this goes to show. But of course, all the fact checkers in the media, if this on the rare occasions that this study is mentioned, they all say, "Oh, it was retracted because it was invalid and it had bad methodologies." Complete nonsense. But they get away with it because of the retraction, because of the cowardly, unscientific, illegitimate retraction of the study. And so this speaks to the point that I was making earlier about the corruption within the journal establishment and within the scientific community itself. And so if you want to understand the answer to that question of well, how can this be? How can the situation exist where you have government health agencies and the mainstream media and really the entire public health establishment, by which I don't just mean like the CDC and the FDA, I'm talking the healthcare providers. I mean, we were getting so much disinformation from our local healthcare providers, from doctors. They were all spreading the same disinformation because they're all just parroting the CDC. And it was all lies and deceptions. So how can this exist? Like, and where are the good scientists? Why aren't they speaking out? And I think, that's a good question. I don't completely understand it myself, but it isn't too hard to understand how people could worry about their careers. If they say the wrong thing, they're going to lose their funding or they're going to lose their jobs. And we've seen how people who do speak out are persecuted and censored. I mean, look at the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration who were speaking out against the lockdowns and advocating a strategy of focused protection, and how they were censored and attacked. Even though the data is now absolutely clear that the approach they advocated would have been the correct approach, because of course the promised benefits of the lockdowns never manifested in the data and caused uncontroversially caused devastating harms. So there was absolute policy, disaster. So you can see, I mean, we can literally see how people who do speak out and who do tell the truth are being censored. Again, I was censored or I was actually banned from LinkedIn for a time, for reporting accurately how the CDC's August 21 claim that the vaccines induced superior immunity to natural immunity was contradicted at the time by virtually all of the non-CDC originating scientific literature, and was a few months later falsified in a published paper by the CDC's own data as reported by its own researchers in its own MMWR journal, where
That's
they admitted that natural immunity offered better protection against the Delta variant than being fully vaccinated. So and for reporting that, I was literally citing the CDC, and yet I got banned from LinkedIn for reporting that. So people, you can kind of begin to see how it can be that this situation can exist, and is perpetuated, because people will lose their careers, they will be attacked, they will be censored for telling the truth.
That's incredible. Well, thank you for sharing your own personal sacrifices and experience, and for taking the time to document Dr. Paul Thomas's. I think that when someone is in the middle of persecution, it can be so the fear response, the panic, the potential of loss, the all of the ramifications of it. Our movement really needs to come around and surround these people. It reminds me of the story of David. He sent Uriah to the front lines of the battle and told the soldiers to withdraw, and the Lord called that murder. And rightly so, that was. And so for us to have these doctors and scientists and journalists on the front line, I really think that our movement needs to come around, stay connected to you guys, surround you, and to cause, outrage when you are persecuted in this way. Because even with lawsuits, a lot of times people think, well, I wasn't hurt that bad by the policy. Well, the people who are hurt really bad, they're going to have a hard time in their loss and in their personal tragedy mounting that lawsuit. So as we all band together and move together, I think there's protection in numbers. And I think that the deep dive that you did today on Dr. Paul Thomas's case does fortify the belief just to look deeper and to go beyond the headlines. And you provide people an opportunity to do that on your website. So thank you for that. I hope you do publish your course where you can train more of us to think like you, and to live like you. You really are the antidote to the corruption. So thank you for just kind of the testimony of how you live and what you do. Any concluding thoughts of encouragement for people? You know what? I will say one more. I do have a word of encouragement, and then you can share yours, which is that there has been and will be times when a swift, decisive response needs to come on social media. When we had the inevitable of an NFL player whose heart stopped on Monday Night Football, televised broadcast, that is not the time to say, oh, we don't know, blah, blah. That is the time to hose information. And Toby Rogers, man, he got it right. He just was like, now is not the time to be diplomatic and say, well, we'll see how his test results come out. Well, no, of course they're not going to share his vaccine history after the fact. Of course they're going to do everything to coach and to massage, play and try and gaslight us from the obvious thing that we just saw, is that no, it is not normal for athletes in the prime of their life to be just dropping on fields like what we are seeing in mass numbers, whether he is technically a part of that or not. We are seeing a lot of athletes drop. And when that happens on national television, it is the time to have, someone like Jeremy Hammond in your back pocket that you can just throw this down. And so I do think that our movement surrounding, and a lot of us are keyboard warriors, and you can drop this information in a way that as additional psyops come, that an overwhelming response to truth, an educated, powerful mass response is needed, and we are capable of that when we have this really excellent, he's on Twitter, just retweet him, what I mean? It takes 30 seconds. And I would say that, I mean, you probably spend half of your time writing and half of your time trying to share your writing and get it out there. And if we could just help you by sharing and retweeting and being prepared for these moments, I really think that we can strategically win, particularly at these historic moments of these psyops where something major happens. The public outrage needs to be clear and well informed, and there needs to be an overwhelming response to truth in these moments.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I really appreciate you bringing that up, because for me to get my message out to people, I absolutely depend on my community of readers for that. I mean, it's them tweeting it, it's them sharing it on Facebook or on Twitter or wherever, sending it to friends and family via email, however they're getting it out. That's the way that my messages get out, and that's the way I'm able to reach people with my messages. So that's really super important for people to do. Anyone can do that, right?
Anyone, yeah.
And just in terms of, I want to end on a note of optimism. We have seen, as a result of the absolute overreach and the blatant blazing lies that we've been told, there has been a really astonishing awakening. I mean, just comparing pre-pandemic to now, in terms of people's, just the fact that the untrustworthiness of the CDC is like a topic of mainstream discourse. That's phenomenal. Right, that never happened before. You have things like the lawsuit against the government, the Biden administration, that it looks like it's going to be going to the Supreme Court, and that includes like Jay Bhattacharya and the authors of the great, at least him. I'm not sure about the other authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, suing the government for this censorship regime, where the government was pressuring the social media companies to censor not just untrue information, but to censor factually accurate information that went against the government policy goals. So there is, there's reason for hope. And it's just a matter of all of us doing what we can to, number one, educate ourselves, and two, to share that knowledge with others. And that's how we win. That's what it comes down to.
I think that the cultural climate in which these lawsuits or these retractions of studies are taking place, that we can meaningfully contribute to a world. For example, the former Health Freedom Summit affiliate manager lost her lawsuit as a teacher in New York with a perfect track record. She had a lawsuit where her mental sanity was questioned because she affirmed parents' rights to, she thought that the medical literature on masking was ambiguous enough, or that parents could make their own informed decisions here, and her mental health was questioned over that, and her teaching license revoked. And there is something to say about a general cultural climate where it's unthinkable that it's like, no, like, good people disagree on this, and this type of punitive this type of ruling, we should create a culture where that's unthinkable, that someone would be treated that way, because the general consensus just does not support it. We just would not tolerate, there should be outrage about this. So informing yourself, sharing that information literally takes half of the load off of our frontline warriors. So for everyone, I know for myself, like, I have actually, like, I did not actually on Substack, or making those, like, some people, they don't even have Substack, but you have to go and make a PayPal donation. I have gotten to the point where I'm like, okay, I didn't do this before because I just wasn't, it wasn't a habit, but I actually will go and am supporting monthly these people that I think are doing our most excellent work and supporting those of us who have been persecuted. And so please share, please financially give, please stay in contact. Jeremy R. Hammond .com. Did I get it right?
Yep.
I don't have it in front of me. Jeremy
Jeremy
R.
R.
Hammond
Hammond.com. Yes.
.com is where you can stay connected to him. Again, these really detailed articles that are footnoted. And thank you so much for your work and everything you do for our field. We're very lucky to have you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thanks so much.